architectural practice and communication. This module will answer the question, what are the responsibilities of a professional architect? When we think about an architect, what is the first thing that you think? What is the role? What do they have to do? Perhaps you're thinking that they get to design, they get to be creative, they get to think on paper and create these amazing projects that eventually become real projects. They go from a drawing and an idea to an actual building that you can walk through. And you are correct. There's other layers to this that sometimes people are not aware, such as architects. They are advocates for their clients. They are trying to push forward the idea and the goal that the client has. What are some of the specific needs and specific things asked for the client? So the architect is trying to convey these not only through drawing, but sometimes also when the project is being built. They have to coordinate with those involved in design. So any project, when you see anything finished, most likely on a bigger scale, and even in smaller scales, it's different people coming together to work on that project. It's not just the architect, but the architect does have this responsibility to coordinate, to talk with the mechanical, the electricians, to talk with the engineers, to talk with the surveyors, to be able to coordinate in this big project. So there's a lot of coordination. Architects, they do have to also be aware and adhere to the building codes. So being up to date with the latest codes, being up to date with the latest things that change within the city, within the state, and within the country that you live in. And not only that, but architects are very much involved in communicating with all the different types of parties. So not only do they coordinate, but they're also communicating constantly with all these different industries, organizations, and so on. So you can see that the architect might wear a lot of different hats. So we're going to be talking about some of these things, and I guess during this lecture, specifically the idea of codes. What are some codes that the architects need to be aware of or sort of include in their projects? And the idea of communicating. How do architects communicate their ideas not only to the client but to everyone involved? So we're going to first begin by mentioning the idea of construction documents. Construction documents is the actual documents that will be used for construction, right? That's sort of straightforward. But these documents, they have a lot of information that becomes utilized, right? These are not just pretty pictures. These are not just schematic lines. These are documents that provide the enough and required information for the project to actually be built, right? So the architects have to communicate the specific needs of this specific building, because eventually structural engineers need to calculate the size and the arrangement of the force and the loads of these structural elements, right? MEP will use them to design the building's mechanical system. The contractors eventually they're going to use this as a guide or as a what guides them in the actual construction project. And the building inspectors will also evaluate the compliance with local, state, national, and international building codes. So we can see how this form of communication, which are construction documents, it becomes utilized and reviewed by different entities in a way. And so in this blue box, you can see that a great number of drawings are necessary to communicate the characteristics of bigger or more complex projects with enough detail to build them. This is why sometimes you'll see some of these document sets to be in the hundreds, right? I've seen some more than 300, more even some specifications in the 900 pages, right? And you're like, maybe you're thinking, I didn't think it was going to be that many pages. But think about it, right? All the details, all the specifics, everything that really goes into a project, you want to be very, very not only specific and detailed, but you want to be provide enough information and all the necessary information to be able to be built. So I was talking about construction documents, but let's talk a little bit about the overall process of the phases of the building design. Perhaps you've seen this before, but when it comes to the role or the sort of the phases that the architect goes through, we talked about construction document, and this one has it's all you provide all dimensions, all specifications. It's very, very, very detailed. But before that, you get into more of the pre-design. This you start getting research, outlining the goals, meeting with clients. You sort of begin to understand what the project will be about. And then the schematic is when you start designing, but everything is very free flow. There's nothing, it's very conceptual in a way. So there's not, this is where you start creating some images, some ideas, some sketches, just to portray and represent your idea. And then you really start to make, emphasis on those ideas and be more clear and specific. And those ideas that were very loose and free and sketches start to really become a little bit more developed. Once that is approved and all of those stages sort of have approvals, it gets into the construction. Right now it's said there's no more changes, or hopefully no more changes, in those documents. Those construction documents are built, are produced, and finally the construction begins, right? And so usually this is sort of how it looks, right? Pre-design this design, then build, and then you evaluate, right? You occupy the building. And if you want to think about it financially, right, this will vary from where you work or the office, but this is sort of how they start to sort of the amount of hours and sort of the percentage of fee that comes into each of these phases. Now we're going to talk a little bit about codes. We talked earlier that we're going to be focusing on these two, and I already talked a little bit about communicating through construction documents and other types of documents, but we're going to start a little bit with codes. So the idea of building codes goes back very far. And there's this code by the Hammurabi Code in 1780 BCE that said if a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built falls and kills the owner, then the builder shall be put to death. That's sort of like a building code, right? So that puts a lot of pressure on whoever's building this, right? And it goes on a little bit. You can read this a little bit more. If it kills the son, then the son also, his son dies as well. It sounds a little harsh, and I'm kind of, I'm very thankful that's not how it works now. But there's still a lot of codes that if things go wrong, there is some sort of penalties, right? That happens, because at the end of the day, we want the safety and well-being of everyone. It's not just a nice building that looks pretty and looks modern and fancy, but is it really a safe place to live? Is it really providing us an adequate and safe livable space or usable space? So that's what sort of building codes do. They provide these boundaries that create a sort of standard, mainly to provide a safe place that is accessible and usable for everyone, including people with disabilities, and that they're trying to create, fall into the standard that of value, appearance, and usability by not only them, but everyone in the community. So this idea of codes, it might seem a little tedious, like, oh, I have to read this book and I have to look at the codes and learn the codes, and there's a huge book, and the codes they constantly are being updated, right? And you might be like, oh man, I don't want to do that. That's too much work. But when you really think about it, the importance of them, it makes you want to stop and say, I see why they are so important, and you make it a responsibility as a standard for an architectural practice. So some of the codes that you'll eventually encounter include, such as this one, the International Building Code. Uh, this is it helps to be able to provide a standard and at the sort of international level. And there's, as I mentioned, revisions and amendments and all of these things constantly change. And this is an example of the 2015, right? And so the building code states that they're the basic model for essentially almost every state, right? This is talking about the USA, but each state does still allow amendments, which means that there will still be variations from state to state, right? And but also that there might be also local jurisdictions, right, that can make modifications on this code. So this sort of goes like, the whole United States has some sort of standard, but then the state of Texas or California might vary, but then the county or that jurisdiction will change, could still change. Some amendments require fire or sprinkler systems that might be optional in some codes, right? So that's why it's very important to be familiar with your region and where you're building, and to know what is required to where you're going to be working. So this is sort of how it looks. Well, if you go into the IBC, you'll see several chapters defining different areas of construction, and it'll provide different information. Right? This is some of the most popular sections, but again, you'll have to be familiar with everything eventually, and you'll come back maybe to some sections more than others, but at the end of the day, they're all important. Another one of those codes is the federal and national building codes, and these types of codes they're trying to really help the general public, and specifically one of those, which is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. This happened in 1990, and it was this federal civil rights law that required that all buildings should be accessible for people with disabilities, right? And so this included hearing, vision, speech, cognitive impairments, as well as people short statured with limited mobility, and that maybe not necessarily requiring use of wheelchair. One of the most comments that people usually address is wheelchair, but it covers a lot more, right? And what it was really trying to do is that there might be some barriers that these buildings create for these users, right? And so it's trying to be more accessible, and so this was a big change. So now all new buildings have to comply with this, right? Older buildings are sort of in the works; they're in the process of being remodeled or repurposed to be to sort of comply with this ADA. So this is one of the few building regulations, and that is a law and not really a code, right? This is law and that. So it does require, as I mentioned, some retrofitting of projects from that were in the past. So I want you to maybe pause this video and think, how does this image make you feel? Right, imagine you are in this wheelchair, or your family member, or someone maybe someone you don't even know, but you just see someone there, right? And there's no other access to this space, and then this person is sitting there, right? It makes you feel like it's like they were not considered, and so every building that's designed should take into consideration the usage of every person, right, regardless of their situation. And so in this case, that is what ADA is trying to do, right? And so there's a lot of changes that come from this, such as hallways having specific width, specific heights between on types of doors and archways, and minimums and max, the passing, ways of maneuvering, things that are extruded, minimum headroom. There's all these different now standards, right, that we have to follow. And again, if you think about it, you could be like, why do I need to learn this? I just want to do, whatever I want. But if you're thinking the grander scheme of things, you're trying to really respect everyone and build for everyone. So some of the types of that have started to, because of these laws, regulations, some of the changes that have happened are these combinations of ramps with stairs, right? So it becomes still a stair for mobility, but also a ramp for mobility, right? And so it kind of starts to combine these things. So some people like it, some people don't. That's really, I'll leave it up to you, and that's a debate for another time. But when it comes to space, right, it's this idea of how people are using the space. So something that's important to think is that bigger sometimes is not necessarily better, right? That's why this codes they try to really not only say minimum, but sometimes they say it has to be between this and this, because there's some dimensions, some types that help in a way to provide easier mobility for grabbing and holding onto things, right? And so this goes into restrooms and other types of spaces. The Federal Housing Act, which was FFHA, which includes part of the housing and urban development, this really was trying to focus on regulating more of all the residential complexes of 4 or more dwellings, right? And so that also then had to deal with disabilities. So one of these things that they changed is that all the residential complexes, they must provide access to all the units on the ground floor must be accessible from a ramp or an elevator. So this idea that creating some of these spaces designated for people with disabilities. The standard of care. The standard of care has to do with that it's a legal term defining the level of quality of service that a practitioner is expected to meet. So this is sort of like the minimum criteria for the design to be sort of caring about the health and safety, welfare of the people living in these spaces. And I don't know I want you to think about this as well. What do you think when the word minimum standard of care? Do you think as architects should we be doing the minimum? So this sort of leads to that highlighted portion at the bottom, and this is higher than the minimum standard defining by the code. So it's this idea that yes, we can do the minimum, and the code is sort of helping on that to have this standard of care, this sort of minimum standard of care, but we can still go beyond that, right? Might require extra time, might require extra money, but there is, as an architect, you can still go above that. Because the question that you really need to ask yourself is, what's the most important thing about the building? That it gets completed on time, that the budget you're under budget, that it looks pretty, some people stop and take pictures, that it's included in an architectural magazine, that you get paid. What's the reason for architecture? Right? It's at the end of the day, it's for someone to utilize this space and hopefully use it, create memories, it lasts a long time, and becomes part of the urban development of the world, right? This built environment. But at the center of everything is people, right? So in no case should the property or the protection of the property go above the first thing, which is life and safety. Right? So all these codes, they're really helping towards that. To remind ourselves that the first and foremost goal of the building code is the protection of human life from the failure of life safety preventions in a building or from some sort of structural collapse. So again, I'll ask one more time, how do you feel about building codes? Do you think it's a lot of work and you have to go through all these, or, are you willing to do the minimum and beyond for the safety of everyone? And that concludes our first part of this chapter. Please continue on to the next